it's evident that he cares. What do you care about? Welcome to the Rock Newman Show. It's the Rock Newman Show.
Hi, folks. My name is Rock Newman. Thank you so much for once again tuning into the Rock Newman Show 2.0. So, okay, this is one day post seeing the TYRE Nichols murder. And we thought about doing something last night, but I wanted to give myself at least some time to digest. I'm glad I did, because I was so extraordinarily angry that if I had done this last night, I might have suggested some remedies that was as violent, if not more violent, than the violence perpetrated by those five police officers. So I had a chance to sleep on it. You know, I went to bed feeling despondent. And if I could, I'd like just take a moment to give you a perspective that I have through some lived experiences, which didn't really end in violence. But seeing TYRE Nichols' murder, it made me more in touch that what I had experienced, what I had been exposed to, quite possibly could have ended in murder. I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't think about it at the time. But watching that film last night and watching the murder in Memphis, it made me identify with two things that stand out. 50 years ago, when I was 50 years ago, when I was 20 years old, I had my oldest brother had a career as a cement truck driver. Then he was a Mack truck salesman, and then he became a manager, and he was passed over multiple times by those with less seniority to become the sales manager of the Mack Truck Corporation there in the Washington, D.C. area. He got frustrated, and he started his own company. It was a cement company, which he knew everything about. It became an extraordinarily successful company. The folks at the Mack company had no idea of his plans, but he created this concrete company, and it was called Opportunity Concrete. And what he did is he offered opportunities to African Americans who were constantly being denied opportunities to work at other companies. I've always been exceedingly proud of him for that. One of the other things he had done is he had been a bus driver for O'Roy Chalk's company way back in the day, DC Transit. He had befriended a white police officer who was retiring. The police officer told him that he no longer had use or could keep his K9, could no longer keep his police dog. And he wanted to gift it to my brother Ralph for all the courtesies that he had given him. He gave that K9 dog to Ralph and said, if you ever have, he did not know my brother was black. By looking at him, like some people don't know I am by looking at me. But he told my brother that if you ever have any problems with these black folks out here, you tell the K9, go get them niggers. So my brother said, what did you say? He said, if you have any problem with all these black people here in DC, tell whatever his name was, let's say Fido, tell Fido to go get those niggers, which is obvious that the dog had been trained to respond violently to that command. Go get them niggers. Okay? Now, I don't have anything else about that story. That's just kind of what it made me think about last night. This TYRE Nichols thing made me think about last night. And my second experience was in 1992 in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And Riddick Bowe had, who I was managing, you know, as the heavyweight champion of the world. He had won the heavyweight championship, had won a couple of, had a fight, and it was like we had hit the jackpot. And he bought a Rolls Royce. I bought a Rolls Royce. One of our other guys bought a new 600 Mercedes, and we rolled down Wisconsin Avenue. And I was like, hey, I want to treat you guys to some ice cream at Thomas Sweet's ice cream shop. And we pulled across the street in an abandoned parking lot and went over to Thomas Sweet to get the ice cream. Maybe we were in there 10 or 15 minutes. When we came back, there was a police officer and several police officers starting to write tickets. And so we said, oh, hey, we're moving the car. We're moving the car. And so the police officer said, well, you should have never parked here. I said, but come on, officer. I mean, we're leaving. And he was very aggressive. And so I asked the question, you know, are you like writing these tickets and being aggressive because there are a bunch of black guys here in brand new expensive cars? He backed up, put his hand on his gun, and said, you say anything else to me and I'll blow your MFing head off. Needless to say, I was in shock. I'm standing there with Riddick Bowe and a couple of other guys who will fight you in a minute. And they kind of got in the pose, and I was like, guys, hold on. And so immediately he called for backup, and immediately backup arrived. The backup was a couple of white guys and a half a dozen black guys. So I said to the black guys, he just told me we're parked here. He told me if I say another word to him, he will blow my MFing head off. Do you all condone that? So, you know, the brothers couldn't really answer. So the situation finally got diffused, but one of the brothers took me down the street a little bit and said, look, man, you know, when we come on a scene like this, you know, we can't go against our fellow officer. The conversation really ended there. Now, I happen to have been the chairperson of Marion Barry's transition team that was in the midst of transitioning. I made a couple of calls, and Mr. Man, who said he was going to bust a cap in my MFing head, retired about 4 days after that. I suspect that the call that I made, the gentleman who was coming in as wanted to be chief of police was already in the high ranks. I suspect he told him he had to get out of there. That's not even so important to this story. So in watching the TYRE Nichols murder last night, it put me in touch with those two incidents in my life. And I go back and I'm thinking, the situation in Georgetown could have led to my murder, or people who I love could have ended in their murder. That was, whatever that was 30 years ago. 50 years ago, we had irrefutable proof that the training of these canines was done so in a racist fashion, that the dog would respond to being told, go get those niggers. So last night, we watched the film of 5 black police officers murdering TYRE Nichols. And so the connection for me is from the horror of 50 years ago and realizing how police officers were trained, how they were training their dogs, to 30 years ago, real, visible, tangible training and attitude and police culture, which had no hesitation to say to me, and then the heavyweight champion of the world, we will blow your MFing brains out. And then we see last night 5 black men murder another black man, TYRE Nichols, who stood 6'3" and somewhere between 140 and 150 pounds, a very slightly built, unarmed brother. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. Cleo Manago. And I specifically called Cleo because in my experience over the last many years, Cleo is an astute appraiser of the human experience, the Black experience, and he is able often to unpack our behavior, the behavior and the impact of white supremacy. So I didn't feel comfortable just coming on here ranting on my own. I wanted to get someone who is smarter than me and who I think would be good for my audience to listen to unpack the horror of the murder of TYRE Nichols. Cleo Manago, thank you for joining me, and please help us on this journey to unpack what happened about 3 weeks ago in Memphis.
Good morning, Rock. I'm not sure I'm smarter than you, but I am very appreciative that you invited me to be a part of your discussion on this heartbreaking issue. Similar to you, I'm going to give your watchers a scenario to remember to create the context of what I'm getting ready to say. I'm from Los Angeles. When I was in my late teens, early 20s, I worked in law enforcement. And the first part of my work as a cadet was working at Viscalus Minimum Security Prison in East Los Angeles. So I was on the inside of the police force or the sheriff department and saw the culture for myself. And I'll say, before I get to the story, that I wind up resigning in protest of racism and oppression, particularly of Black men, when I was doing that type of work. But the scenario I want us to think about that we all saw around the world that happened in my backyard was the Rodney King incident, where he was beat similarly by straight up white men. He didn't die, but his spirit was killed and he died prematurely, resulting from unresolved trauma because of that situation. But the reason I bring up Rodney King is because I was clear as a bell that what happened to Rodney had been happening every day, all the time. But the reason, when I was working in law enforcement, I saw battered Black male and female, but predominantly male bodies all the times in body bags from unarmed Black people who were beat down and murdered by the police, including by Black police officers. I had seen it all the time. However, those kind of beatings did not get national exposure until a videotape was at the Rodney King beating. My point to you is that what happened to Mr. Nichols is not new. It's not the first case this year. It won't be the last case this year. And he is part of a legacy of Black men murdered by the cops. There was no videotape. That's a United States custom. And some of us have driven by some of these beatings and arrests of Black men. And unfortunately, we have said in our mind, well, it figures. The N-word must have done something. And there are some people who heard you talk about your experience with Riddick Bowe and police brutality and going to be thinking to themselves, well, why is he telling us that story? Why is he telling us about white men with dogs when it was Black men who killed Mr. Nichols? That's what some of the people are going to be thinking, because they're not going to understand that the police system began as a slave catcher system and become since then a patrolling of white power and wealth system. And that the whole reason the police department came into existence, in addition to other criminalities, was to control the populace, particularly Black people. So even though, and I'm telling this from somebody who wore a similar uniform, those Black officers were physically Black. Those officers worked inside of a system that does not teach them to value Black life or teach them to understand what Black people go through that leads to conditions that lead to so-called criminality, or that leads to a disproportionate amount of Black people, particularly men, going into prison or being incarcerated or found not guilty through projects like the Innocence Project that uses DNA to prove it. Disproportionately, hundreds of Black men have been let out of prison. They're not thinking about that. They're trying to do a good job for their peers or in front of their peers. One thing that you did say that I think is also relevant is when the brother, when he walked you away, said, we can't advocate for you, or we can't show any support for what you're saying in front of these officers. So it's important, among other things, for Black people who watch this to understand that, yes, it was 5 Black men who murdered a Black man, caught on tape. We all know about it, even though it happens all the time. But we live, since I was a child, almost 70 years have passed. Things are different now than when we were children in terms of Black people being clear about that there's a racism situation. Those Black men who murdered Nichols were young. They may have been in their 30s. And my point is that we're in a generation now of people who don't know their history, who don't have a race analysis, who don't look at the world critically through a Black protected perspective. I'm talking about Black people who don't think about white supremacy mythology and its cause and effect on the Black body. We look at, I don't want to go all over the place, but this is relevant. And this happened in DC because I'm in DC. When I walk down the street now, and I bet it was different when you were younger, Rock, Black men avoid looking at each other, won't even speak. Have you ever experienced that?
Absolutely.
And all the time, I did it this morning. I turn around and say, "You can speak, brother. How you doing?" But the ironic thing, what's heartbreaking about it, is that in most cases they smile and they feel this almost a sense of relief that I've engaged them. But if I didn't do that, we wouldn't have engaged. To me, that's relevant to the 5 Black men, is because contemporary Black men are conditioned not to trust Black men, not to value Black men, not to humanize Black men, and to treat Black men the way white supremacy has taught us. So even though these men were in uniform, so-called gang violence, what happened to Nipsey, the brother that was killed, and there's so many names of Black men who have killed Black men. That's not an unusual thing now. But when I was younger, it was. When I was younger, we even had the Pyrus and the Crips in Compton. They had stupid fights, but nobody killed each other. And killing was not even on the list of options as a possibility. Macho bullcrap was on the table, but actually taking someone's life was not the case. However, this desperate attempt that we have been invested in going over time in trying to replicate whiteness in white people And there was a crack epidemic and all kinds of system-based interruptions of Black life and Black treatment of each other. That we are in a modern age of normalized Black male dehumanization that is also embodied by police officers who are Black. Not all police officers, but there's a critical mass nationally of Black men who are in uniform, who are practicing misdirected rage on other Black men. And even if people are caught up in this tangible, this particular point, even if there's Black people who are watching the murder of Mr. Nichols and saying, look what those Black people did to each other, what I want them to understand is that what happened to Mr. Nichols almost never happens to white men. There's not going to be a lot of video where 5 white cops are kicking and murdering a white man or Black men, frankly. A bunch of Black cops killing, murdering, and kicking to death a white man. So keep it in context. There's a particularly focused anti-Black reaction going on in this phenomenon. Even if the officers are Black, the origins of the attitude are white, including
Cleo,
those Black with the dogs.
Cleo, the one thing I did do, I was trying to temper myself after watching the clip. The one thing I did do publicly was I went on my Facebook page and I simply wrote quintessential self-hatred and depraved indifference. And my sense was that unless the powerful impact of white supremacy, if that powerful impact plays, I think, its greatest role in fostering self-hate amongst Black folks. And when there is that self-hate, those 5 officers to me were the example of when there is self-hate of yourself. However you came about that, and certainly the prism and the dynamic of white supremacy always plays a role in that.
Absolutely.
That when there is that kind of self-hate and you are beating the crap out of another Black man, you some kind of way are nurturing that self-hate or expressing that self-hate in that kind of diabolical behavior. And so you got that. And then the depraved indifference of them beating him to a pulp where he slumps from side to side. And they're walking around and they're starting to kind of get their story together. He's super strong. He must have been on some drug. Or, any of us who have spent any time in the street or in any kind of a suite that understands human behavior knows what they were doing right there. They thought, and did they think they were slick? They were concocting a story already because there was a sense of realizing, oops, we might be in trouble. And the trouble that they were in my opinion, to a large extent, would stem from that self-hatred and a culture which continues to exist, which gives them a sense of having a license to do those things. Your thoughts?
I want to talk about the term self-hate.
Okay.
I agree with you that it's self-hate. However, the majority of people who are suffering from self-hate, that doesn't compute. That analysis or diagnosis doesn't compute. For example, Michael Jackson, who practiced self-imposed so-called vitiligo, which he did himself. When you bleach your skin, you can induce vitiligo reaction in pigment. He did that to himself. Cut off his nose, etc., and would still say he didn't hate himself. Matter of fact, at first he denied even getting operations, though Ray Charles could see that he had got operations, but he said he didn't. He also has 4 lily white kids that he went and bought and claimed they're partly black. All that to say that, I mean, Michael Jackson was also a bunch of wonderful things, also a genius, also brilliant, also seemingly a very good-hearted human being. However, he suffered from a deep case of anti-black white supremacy internalization. But there's some people who are very intelligent, who are simply human beings living their lives, who have internalized these anti-black norms, who don't see it as self-hate. So sometimes, even when you tell them it's self-hate, it'll shut them down because they just don't see it that way. However, once someone with patience and a couple of skills or intentionality engage them and do some cause and effect and some connect the dots in their lives and in their behavior, they can help them see what they're doing, but they still won't call it self-hate. If somebody has the courage to put on a uniform, put on their shoes, comb their hair, go to work, drive a nice car, because most police will make a decent salary, and have the courage and the capacity to have a middle class or upper middle class job, they think that they're doing well. They think that they are the opposite of self-hate because look what I've done, look what I'm doing. So one thing that has to occur in this society for Black people to come out of the white supremacy trauma trance or the anti-Black trauma trance is we have to be real clear about how white supremacy works. For example, I have tons of stories, and I might have even said this before on your show. I was at a store, and this Black woman was mad at her little baby, her adorable little boy, child, for taking too long to stay caught up with her. And she turned around and she said, "Nigga, if you don't get your little black ass over here, I'm gonna beat the black off of you." Now, you probably have heard those kind of phrases before. Okay. I know I have. And it's a normal part of the Black experience. It's an abnormal part of self-love because it doesn't fit within the realm of that. But it's a normal part of the degradation that white supremacy has made normal in our behavior and circumstances. And we do a lot of low rating of Black people. So I say that to tell a story of the seedlings of how a Black child can grow up inadvertently questioning the value of Blackness in Black people through their mothers who loves them. So we have to understand that the United States of America is an anti-Black society. It's a racist, dangerous society, even now. The body count when it comes to Black men being killed and Black women, but Black men when it comes to the cops mostly, is just as high as it was 50 years ago. The numbers have not gone down. The point is that we're not alarmed about it. We're alarmed right now because it's on video. We're alarmed right now as a people because we're embarrassed, we're humiliated, and we don't want to go out like that. But unfortunately, Rock, what's going to occur, and this self-hate goes beyond those cops, is that we're going to go back and relapse back into our normal anti-Black culture where the media is racist, where strong voices who have commentary, such as yourself and others, are not platformed enough to be heard on a daily basis in mainstream media, et cetera, because they don't want us to be out of the trance. They want us to stay in trance. And we're going to forget about this. Similar to what happened to George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, we can go on and on and on. Our rage is temporary because that we value each other and ourselves is temporary because white people are who we permanently are concerned about. You may have heard in your lifetime when you talk to Black people about being concerned about Black people, you must have heard somebody in your life say, "Here you come with that Black stuff."
Oh my God. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think I might have mentioned this before too, because I've said it a lot. I have an Asian friend who's Korean. And I asked him, I said, when Koreans advocate for Koreans and make sure Koreans have what they need and who resist any kind of oppression or barriers to progress among Koreans. And there's Korean people that take that on. Do you ever roll your eyes and go, here come them people, that Korean shit again? And he looked at me like, huh? I mean, that kind of thinking just didn't, he couldn't even imagine that. I said, well, in the Black community, because of the unresolved symptoms of the degradation that came out of the enslavement experience for almost 300 years, Black people get exacerbated and bothered by Black people talking about pro-Black issues, but we don't realize that's white codependency. And it's the same phenomena as a sister or a brother who is in a domestic violence relationship who almost feel like something is missing if they don't get their butts whooped.
Yeah. So,
and that's us in the context of white supremacy. So some of us are not mad about that beating. Some of those guys who were in that beating were doing it for the same reason that a violator is a domestic violator, because we feel like this is what they deserve.
That's a great observation, man. And it makes me think about a conversation a few weeks ago. I was telling someone who I had recently, I don't know if I befriended the person. We became acquaintances and, went walking, joked. A white guy. I called him my Jewish brother. And I was telling him about an incident that I had just experienced, which was so obviously racist, just tinged with racism in terms of my communication with another white person. And I had text verification. I had receipts of the racism. And although he comes forth as an extraordinarily liberal person, liking Motown music and all that kind of stuff, he spent an inordinate amount of time. Say, well, let me just play devil's advocate. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it wasn't racism. And I would explain. Then I pulled out my phone and showed some text. He was like, but that might not have been what they were thinking. So the other thing that happens with white supremacy is it creates a dynamic that what this white man was doing, he was running away from trying to defend and run away from the possibility that it might have been racist, because he didn't want to have to think his people or his friends, they don't want to have to think about that. So finally I asked him, I said, why are you debating me on this? I know what's happening. I know what racism is. If I didn't know from the verbal communication, I got the goddamn text that shows you in black and white how racist it was. Why do you feel a need to debate me and to play devil's advocate to try to suggest some kind of way that it might not be racist? What's your answer? He ain't had one. He didn't have one. Again, that ever overarching impact of what has been the diabolical brilliance of white supremacy.
Well, I don't have that many debates with people who are called white about this issue, because I use my energy like people use gas when their tank is low. I got to use my gas, very focused, in a focused way, because I don't got that much. Yeah. So 99% of my time is spent in the presence of Black people. And my staff includes people who are white and all kinds of people, predominantly Black in my staff, because my work involves everybody and I support that, and I'm there to make sure that's successful. But particularly my personal time, It's predominantly with Black people because I live to do reparative work, to do restorative work, to do work that's going to stop the damage that's being done and repair what has been done to Black people. So my point in saying that is that I've run into Black people who are the same way, and so have you, who with receipts and go, well, maybe it wasn't racism. You know, you think everything's about race. I remember, and the reason I'm thinking about this is because I'm writing something about Jeffrey Dahmer right now. And I remember when Jeffrey Dahmer was first on the news, and there was stories being put out that he was killing people. They didn't mention what race they were. I deduced, based on some scenarios that are being described, that they were Black. A Black friend and I were at his house sitting on a couch when the Jeffrey Dahmer situation was first brought into the news. And we got into a big argument, mostly him, because he was mad at me when I said, I bet you those men are Black. You think everything's about race. Everything's not about race. I said, we're not talking about everything. We're talking about one thing right now. And I think it's about race. It sounds like these brothers are probably Black. But the majority of the resistance I experience, probably because most of the people I experience are Black. And I experience lots of Black people as somebody who works in the health and human services field. And I'm telling you right now, the majority of them are in denial, and that's not even the proper word. I put it in the terms I usually use. The majority of them are in the trauma trance, and who are so deep in the trauma trance and in this desire not to offend white people and whisper when they talk about racism. If they do it all, they whisper the word white. Grown people, they get mad when you bring up racism because they have a codependency on white supremacy mythology, and they have an anti-Black internal narrative, and they'll mind you being anti-Black. I'll give you one more example, and I may have mentioned this before because it happened a short while ago. I was at a mall in Anne Arundel Mall, about my own business, and these two young men came up to me and they said, "Are you that Dr. Manago person?" I said, "Maybe." And I could tell they were going to have a complaint because their posture was not warm and fuzzy. And they said, "You know, I heard you don't like white people, and that's not right. You know, you shouldn't say stuff that's racist and against white people." And I stayed calm, which is part of my strategy. I don't believe in going off on even Black people who are problematic. I still keep my equilibrium. And I said to them, I said, "Have you ever had that kind of passion and anger towards somebody and publicly have confronted them for being anti-Black or being racist toward Black people? Has that ever pissed you off enough to confront anybody in public?" And the whole notion was like my Korean friend who I asked, were people anti-Korean or mad at Koreans for supporting them? That same look of, they had the same look, like they were in a trance. So the idea of being an advocate for Black people or advocate against hatred and bad behavior toward Black people didn't compute. And that's, I would say, based on my travels across the country, which are relatively frequent, is at least half of this country, Black people are in that state. And as I said earlier to someone, what happened to Mr. Nichols is not unusual. In small towns, large towns, big cities, middle-sized cities, Black men are being murdered and disfigured, if not weekly, daily, but it doesn't make the news because we're all in unconscious agreement that NAS, and NAS means, I don't like saying it because I don't believe in the terminology, but it means niggas ain't shit.
Yeah.
I don't say the word, I don't believe in the word, but when I say NAS, I got to break down what I mean by that so people can know what I'm saying. And until we come out of that trance, we're gonna have more Tamirs, more Mr. Nichols. We're gonna have more coming, and there's more we don't know about, Rock. And it won't change until we admit that we live in an anti-Black society, until we admit the strategies they have. The last strategy I'll give, if I be quiet here for a moment, is this biracial agenda. You've watched TV enough and gone to movies enough and seen enough TV where they keep showing almost everybody Black with a white partner. And it's not a coincidence that Kamala, Natanji, and Clarence Thomas, Van Jones, all the black men who have shows on CNN, etc., that these people all have white partners. That's another strategy to interrupt capacities that have loyalty to blackness on a macro and micro level. We need to recognize these things. Yes, love is love, but I'm not talking about love. I'm talking about patterns. There's no such thing as an accidental pattern. There is such thing on planet Earth as black people who love black people. So how come we can't find them on television without a magnifying glass or a telescope? This is social conditioning and social controlling, and believe me, it trickles down to a lot of things, including the murder of black men by black cops.
Cleo, your term, your acronym, NAS. I don't know if it was sometime in the past when I was doing a show with you or someone else, I talked about a phraseology that I had heard. And it was one, there was a shoe shine shop and a barber shop next to each other. And the two owners and their teams kind of disliked each other. And this was in black neighborhood. And each of them used the same terminology, the same term, the same quote unquote point. And here's what it was. I hate niggas and flies. The more I see niggas, the better I like flies. Now, what a despicable way of communication that they kind of casually threw around. And I said it because I wanted to talk about the utter ignorance and self-hatred of that phraseology. There was a couple of people who had watched that show and commented, and they absolutely roasted me. And, whether it was taken or not, I was making a point. I was making a point. And not to communicate the language becomes a failure to be able to communicate and to make the point. So that kind of casuality of self-hatred and ignorance is something that those of you who are watching, if anybody wants to throw something at your computer or phone or TV or whatever, go on and do it. But again, there's a message in there that I hope is a message that is also a lesson. So we started out, and the focus of my doing this at this time was to examine the circumstances, the situation, the dynamics around the murder of TYRE Nichols by 5 Black individuals. And I think I may have done this with you before, Cleo, to come to you with the impossible. And that is, talk to us about a solution or some solutions to start to eliminate this kind of barbaric behavior.
Black people have to first admit that we were enslaved to this country and that we spent more time, even to this day, in a bonded situation than the time we've been alive since so-called freedom.
And not talk about, like so many in my family do. Uncle Rock, why you keep on talking about slavery? What that got to do with anything?
Yeah, well, in fact, we have not been quote unquote free yet for as long that we were in bondage.
Speak.
Anybody who studies psychology knows that the trauma inducing period, the rape, the hurt period, healing has to occur and sometimes depending on how deep the scar is, the healing period might be at least as long as the period took to actually wound people. It takes time, but what makes the time shorter to heal is admitting that you've been traumatized, admitting that there's a wound. And every time we think the N word, every time we use the N word, we are re traumatizing ourselves and re-scarring the scar tissue. Those young Black men who killed that Black man probably heard, because I've done speaking engagements where there were thousands in the audience, and I asked them, have they heard that term and used that term, and almost everybody raised their hands. Those were the little boys once upon a time who lived in this anti-Black society, who likely heard implications that being Black had lesser value, or one of them might be mad at their Black father. I mean, people who become cops on, and I know this personally, are not these homogenized folks who did not come from the community, who have a different set of values and ways of being. They come from human beings. They come from a United States experience. The United States experience is anti-Black. We have to start decoding all the anti-Blackness around us and teaching our children to decode it so they can recognize it and deflect the implications of the anti-Blackness. For example, the majority of television shows, there's maybe one exception, but the majority of television shows like Power, or there's a new show called Your Honor, there's all kinds of shows, they depict Black people as criminals or as people with some kind of criminality in their immediate environment. We have to be bothered by that. Another thing that might sound weird, but I'm gonna say it anyway. For example, we gotta learn how to read between the lines. The NFL apologized for their racism, but they wouldn't hire Colin Kaepernick back, who was fired because of their racism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just recently.
Say that again. Say that again for the folks up in the raft.
In the back. The NFL, I'm gonna add a word to play this word. The NFL played us, not me and not Rock, and apologized for the racism, but they wouldn't rehire Colin Kaepernick, who they fired because they were racist. So we need to not have a passive, quiet reaction. We need to be up in arms. We need to act like we used to act, and how the gay community acts now. If you look at them sideways, you have hell to pay. We are relaxed and complacent in the midst of a perpetual assault that we have now internalized, that's boasted by the N-word. We should not be buying into the use of that term because it re-implies our lesser value than other people. Now, what some people are gonna say, because they're white codependent, they've been trained to deflect what I'm saying, is that, well, everybody uses the word. Anybody can be that. No, let's be clear. The majority of the people who use that word who are not Black are mimicking youth culture or Black hip hop culture. When they become 30 and 40, they meant it when they said it as a kid, but when they become 30 and 40, they use it. But Black men have always been the embodiment of cool. You know, Miles Davis, the birth of the cool. Black men have that swagger, and everybody wants it, particularly when they're kids. So everybody wants to do and walk like Black people, even if it's dysfunctional, because they don't know the whole story. They just think it must be cool. So don't get caught up in other people using that word. It is an insult. You're not going to hear Jews say, "I'm living my best life. I ain't got time for them kikes. I ain't going back and forth with those kikes." Or Asians say, "I'm living my best life," and it becomes a #1 hit on the radio for everybody to hear. "I'm not going back and forth for my own people. I'm living my best life." Check out what that implies. Yeah. I'm living my best life. I'm not lowering myself to my worst life to be bothered with you Black folks. And it becomes a #1 hit.
And
we need to.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to reiterate that we need to recognize and deflect the ton of anti-Black implications in this culture that our children go from baby to adult with, that has them acting out on each other in the workplace, including as policemen or women with guns. We have to stop being in denial, and we have to learn to love Black people in not esoteric ways, but in very blatant, clear, concise ways and understand the beauty and the wonderfulness of Black people and what's great about us, and that we are constantly being promoted into thinking we're lesser in value because there's a community made up predominantly of white people who benefit from Black self-hate.
Cleo, you keep giving me reasons every time we communicate to nominate and then vote for you to become the president of these here un-United States. Thank you so much for joining me today, man. I love you, brother.
Thank you for inviting me, and I love you back. And I look forward to talking to you again. And hopefully over something that's going to be constructive and more positive than this murder. But I'm glad to be helpful in the conversation on the issue.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Folks, that wraps us for this evening. Thank you for joining. Please, hey, I don't do this very often, but please make sure that you hit the like button, the subscribe button, and any of the buttons. I'm not the most technological sound senior citizen here, but subscribers help us bring you this kind of programming. God bless you, and I'll see you the next time.